Hi, this is Roger Green, executive producer and host of the Surfing the Mesh Tsunami podcast. This week, over the holiday week, we will be sharing 5 conversations from episode 27, our coverage of last month's Deliver Meeting 2024. This conversation focuses pretty much exclusively on issues related to patients. It starts with Jeff McIntyre's takeaway from the FDA session, which is that when we talk about surrogate endpoints, patient advocacy has got to get involved and be key. Now, they already are and have been in things like NIMBLE and Litmus and in discussions about reform, but specifically science alone isn't going to move the needle at the speed and necessity with which it has to, he says. It's the need to make drugs viable for patients and trials viable for patients that will really push this issue. Michelle agrees, and Jeff suggests that at the end of the day, the FDA is a political agency, and as a result, healing has patients right in the middle of it. From there, we go on to a poster that Mike Betel wrote and co-chaired in this session. The poster was entitled Patient Voice in Mass Initiative, Foundational Principles for the Conduct of Patient-Centric Mass Research. Mike talks about the breadth of involvement, 6 patient groups, a variety of other companies, and the sponsors, PPD Thermo Fisher. And the outcomes were a set of foundational principles themselves that he felt the group felt would make trials more patient-centric. One about transparency, another about being focused on the whole person, not just the medical, but also the emotional, cognizant of the evolving circumstances of patients that are involved in trials, etc. And also about family and caregiver awareness, so that everybody in the family who's part of the trial understands what's going on. Finally, one about responsiveness to patient needs. It's a brilliant work and a great piece of conversation. As you listen, you'll hear all of our enthusiasm, which was infectious within ourselves, and we hope to those of you who are listening to this episode.
Jeff McIntyre.
When we're talking about the surrogate endpoints, I do think that it is going to be a place where patient advocacy has to get involved. And we're already on, with NIMBLE and Litmus and already in a lot of these discussions, liver forum, et cetera. But this is a specific place where I don't think the science alone is going to be enough to move the needle, so to speak, at the speed and with the necessity that it has to. There has to be, partnership with the scientific community and with the diagnostic community in accordance with the patient community in order to make this happen. I mean, we just have to show the demonstrated need to the FDA with the urgency that I think only the patient community can provide in order to make this happen.
Michelle Long.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, Jeff. I mean, it'd be much easier to just do nothing and carry on, right? So this is an added workload that we're putting on ourselves, but the reason why we're doing it is to support the patients and to make sure that the patients that we're enrolling in clinical trials are also the ones that are the ones that we are going to be prescribing drugs for, and that those that need new treatments, that they also have access to them. So it's hugely important and impactful. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if this were just a scientific equation to come to an agreement on, it would be one thing. But at the end of the day, the FDA is ultimately a political agency, as much as they may cast themselves as the purveyors of, healing and approval for medication. At the end of the day, they're a political entity. And so it really is, we have a real opportunity to have kind of our separate areas work together to push to be able to make this happen. And I think that's a little revelatory in the patient community, at least, of like, wow, here's a place that we really haven't been in the conversation a ton. And I've been fortunate, and Mike's been in those conversations some as well, to be able to be a part of those conversations, but then to see to the outcome that the tip of the spear could be the patient voice that really makes the FDA move in the right direction with the backing of the appropriate and the right scientific consensus.
Roger Green.
You would virtually think it has to be, Jeff, right? Because everybody else takes a risk by doing it, but you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we're also in that unique position to where, even though we talk about this as a conversation between the, scientific community and the FDA, the reality is that if the FDA keeps coming back with questions, I mean, I kind of feel like the two communities just kind of end up pointing at each other a lot of the ways, but we're the group, and sorry, I'm being a real homer for the patients, which is, of course, what I'm being paid to do, is that we're the ones, though, that can go to Capitol Hill And we've seen this recently when you had the requirement or the recommendation for biopsy at the Veterans Administration. We're the ones that put in the request. And then when we don't like it or we don't hear back, we're going to go start talking to Senate Appropriations and to the Authorizations Committee. And the reception is different than if the collection of an individual industry partner or individual sort of diagnostic company, it needs to be hand in hand. And we're the ones that are going to be able to have to demonstrate patient need in this. And I think, frankly, with great hope that this happens in the next couple of years, I think with this incoming administration that priority is going to be even higher.
Being attentive to the clock, why don't we move to the conversation, Jeff, that you thought you and Mike were going to pressage together and go on to there.
Mike, I was talking about our lifestyle session, and I feel like I've put my voice on this podcast quite a lot. If that was on your mind, why don't you lead, or I'll defer to you for what's next.
Mike Betel.
That was fantastic, but that's not what I chose for. There was a lot of really great things. I had 3 different topics, so I'll talk about one of them, if that's okay. But you were involved in that one too, Jeff. So there was a poster that we presented that was entitled Patient Voice in MASH Initiative. So it's a good follow-up from what we just finished talking about. Foundational Principles for the Conduct of Patient-Centric MASH Research. And PPD, Thermo Fisher Scientific, sponsored it. And there was 6 different patient advocacy groups that were involved, including Fatty Liver Alliance. ELPA was part of it, Prometheus, Liver Education Advocates, who were previously known as NASH Knowledge, GLI, and Amigos del Hígado, AC. So I was the lead author on the poster, and I'm super proud of being able to share the outputs from it, and I'll share that with you in a sec. So there was 6 of us and the sponsors that got together for a lot of meetings, and online and in person. We were really looking at how we can reimagine clinical trials for MASH and how they're designed and delivered, and focusing on what matters the most for patients. And the outcomes were a set of foundation principles that make clinical trials more patient-centric. And so the first one was about transparency, and it's about clear and honest communication with participants from the very first day that they're in a clinical trial. So talking about things like placebos, how they're used, and when they'll have access, for example, to the active treatment. The second was about being whole person focused and addressing not just the medical, but also the emotional, which we talked about today, and the practical needs of participants. So being cognizant of the evolving circumstances of the patients that are involved in the trial, because they go through a lot. Patients as partners, so involving patients as collaborators in the trial process rather than just treating them as subjects, dots on a graph or in a data set. The fourth one is about family and caregiver awareness, and we all recognize that a lot of people in the families are part of that, all of the decision and the making and the journey. So recognizing the crucial role that families play, especially as that disease progresses. And the last one's about responsiveness to patient needs. So regularly collecting feedback during trials and acting on it immediately to try to improve the patient experience. And one point I want to also emphasize is how this approach puts patients at the center of the conversation. And what makes this really powerful is the attention to diversity and inclusivity. And trials really need to, and this came up a lot, to be designed to consider cultural and socioeconomic challenges. So the ultimate goal really is to make MASH trials not only more accessible, but also more impactful for everyone that's involved, so the companies and the patients. And it's not just about better data, it's about that trust, the respect, the real world solutions that I mentioned before, and to really deal with the disease that's on the rise globally. So just to end by saying that the poster really ends up being a call to action for the research community and a roadmap for how to listen to patients and incorporate their experiences, and also ultimately an acceleration opportunity to progress the treatment of MASH. So I just wanted to share some of that piece. That's a lot. You were on that too, right, Jeff? So it was
agreed. It was a solid and a great solid process that led up to those results as well. It was great to see the reception and the press we got off of that also.
Mm-hmm. So thoughts from clinical trial people or those involved?
That sounds really fantastic, and also great that you brought so many groups together to come up with a consolidated viewpoint like this. I mean, I think that, and I know we've talked about this as well, incorporating the patient voice into drug development is super critical. It relates to to what we just talked about with the biopsies, of course. But I also really like your comment about the burden on the caregivers as well, because there are other considerations that we have in trials, such as, for example, performing endoscopies. That's not a one person ask. That's you plus your ride home, which often is your family member as well. So it impacts others around you as well. And especially as we're seeing more and more trials coming out in the cirrhosis space, we know that the caregivers are incredibly key to the success of those trials, because they help support the patient in the trial who is often, sick or scared or dealing with a lot on their own. So I really like that part of it. I think that's definitely something that we can do better on, as a whole.
Jörn Schattenberg.
The comment that resonated with me, Michael, was, making everybody benefit on a clinical trial and not putting the sponsor's sole interest into this. But, Jeff also made the comment that we embrace clinical trials as part of the medical care. And I think putting the patient really into the center of these clinical trials here, which are, of course, data generated that's owned by the sponsor in the end, but the benefit they have from that is truly real for me as a clinician, and that's why I do support these multi-perspective views on it too.
And now back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingmash.com. Over the rest of the holiday, we'll be sharing conversations from episode 25, in which Maru Ranella went over expert recommendations on use of resmetirom, and also a conversation Jörn and I recorded with Scott Friedman last summer that never made it to air. Plenty to listen to while you're at home and away. And we'll be back in January covering MASH-TAG and then moving into our new 2025 Surfing Mash V2.0 format. Take care, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.